I appreciate you all showing up today. Thank you very much. Today, I want to get into what I was talking about in the last episode, the amelioration or coming up with ideas in order to solve what may be certain problems we observe and we see both in ourselves and in society itself. Before I do that, I want to give a brief explanation. In some ways, the verbiage that I'm using at times, I suppose, can be a little lofty, perhaps even verbose. It is my intention to explain in the most concrete and definable terms and easy to understand terms anything that I discuss. And in so doing, at certain times, there's going to be words and verbiage and language that maybe is not common to every individual. I tend to look at language and learning the same way that I learned how to play the drums. And what I mean by that is that I always looked for the highest forms of learning. So whether or not that came from Gary Chester and learning all the things that Vinnie Colaiuta was doing and where that had its genesis, where he learned those things from, was always more important to me than just learning a lick. And so I got very busy learning higher conceptual ideas in the drums, in the thing that I was doing. And I take the same approach to language and to conversation on this level in the same way. And that is that I seek out the language that also challenges me and, that gives me pause and gives me something to think about. I'm always learning from and studying people that would inarguably be the masters of things like common sense and reason, philosophy. So the fact that I'm on my own journey here is kind of relatable to what you may be hearing me speak. Again, I want to be very clear and very concise in the terminology that I use. I think that ambiguity and being totally vague or being too vague on a subject. So I'm trying to hone in on something. I'm trying to laser point and focus in and describe the things in the best detail that I can. So I hope you understand that. And should there be a word that you don't understand, there's dictionaries and there's ways to learn these things. And I've heard from other people that, degrees in academia or anything like that, but they feel much differently about this. They tend to understand exactly what I'm talking about. And I think because there is a human element to this, which I want to portray in everything I do. And they feel like I'm speaking right to them and to their hearts and their concerns. And so I'm going to continue using some verbiage, both as a challenge to me personally and to be able to define in the best possible way that I can exactly what I'm talking about. So without further ado, I want to get into today's breakdown of what I'm discussing. And that is, it's going to have its foundations in what is known as the hero's journey. So in part one of Late Stage Celebrity, I acknowledged the physical, sociological, and environmental factors that constitute the reduction of artistic livelihoods and the co-optation of culture. To reiterate, the physical or pragmatic factors in artistic decline are the constitution of industry and market-based principles that are incautiously applied to non-physical assets. The psychological factors are those of self-interest, avarice, greed, power, ambition, and the environmental factors are technology, technocracy, government and corporate merger, which is also known as fascism, which was defined by Benito Mussolini himself, and because he was what we know as a modern-day fascist, I think I'll take his definition. And the other things, I discussed, or at least laid claim to, are things like evolutionary biology, social anthropology, and so on and so forth. In this episode, I will be digging deeper into the issues of biological, psychological, and sociological factors. These are the mechanical components that form our innermost beliefs and biases. What we are embarking on here is the basest of foundation for all the human species. The knowing and establishing of oneself personally and collectively. Now, the finding of oneself, I think, is better explained in two ways. One, even though you no longer contain any of the cellular originality present in your youth, and this is both a medical and a scientific fact, you are somehow still known as what is your numerical self. Therefore, expansion of the psyche, your virtue, your healing, or maybe better said, just managing yourself, all of these attributes are an unearthing of what already exists. In a sense, you're not running around trying to find yourself because you never left to begin with. You may have, willfully or not, misplaced this knowledge, but unconsciously it has always followed right along with you. And I'm not speaking in any sense of mysticism here. I want to speak only in the simple facts of pure logic, reason, and science. Two is what we recognize, or we may have heard about, as the hero's journey. Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey both speak of this archetype that predates even Plato's allegory of the cave. Now, this journey is simple in its explanation, but in no way undemanding in its treacherous pilgrimage. This is in earnest where we begin our journey toward the potential amelioration of all personal and collective ills. So I will outline here what Joseph Campbell's assertions are as he wrote them in his work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. There is much to uncover here and come to terms with where this work is considered. Therefore, in this episode, I will delineate and give explanation and expression for the two elements, the first two, in an ongoing and hopefully fascinating series. It is altogether vital that if resolution is to occur within the hallowed space of art, a space that undoubtedly is corrupted at this point and is without your grand participation, the journey must be undertaken by all of us. If there perhaps is a personal savior, I think he tarries long in us for us to take up the cross and the cause. So, number one, the ordinary world. This is where the hero starts, in the mundane, two-dimensional existence of everyday life, something we're all experiencing right now. In other words, the world in which we live. And what does that look like? Does it look, feel, exist, or even operate as the social, political, economic, cultural, technological, or even educational landscape that you and I have come to know and trust? Or do you sense something different? A change, perhaps, a warping, a distortion, a twisting into logic and reason that resembles more pretzel than straight line. Nonetheless, here you are, going about your day in a regular cog in an old-fashioned and perpetual wheel. An existence that kind of resembles the movie Koyaanisqatsi, which is a Hopi word for life out of balance. It is a matrixian intuition that pervades your thoughts, but you quickly brush it aside. You tell yourself, stop being so fucking stupid. You suppress all further intuitions, quickly replace the mask, or better said, the persona, the inauthentic self that you and me and everyone else spends decades shaping and protecting. You straighten up your jacket and ignorantly get on with the day. However, even though you momentarily shed these thoughts, they do not completely subside. They don't completely go away. Now, although they're brought about by circumstance, and therefore you could say they're circumstantial, the accumulation of anecdote coupled with curiosity and some evidentiary claims hastens you toward the second realm in this journey, and that is the call to adventure. Now, a quick note here. It may be perceived by some that superficially this comes across as fantasy or some kind of a romantic notion that has no bearing in necessary fact. Now, I would admonish those who may follow this shallowness that veils elementary facets of evolutionary biology and the primitive aspects, solely primitive aspects of intuition and curiosity, that these are the basic principles that even a child can comprehend. And I take this from both men and women who are intellectually and academically more sound than you or I that have cataloged these truths, because they have been used for reproof, instruction, and have given birth to some of the greatest cautionary tales that we only marginalize as mere entertainment. So, the individual, you, me, whoever, receives a call to action. Now, this call to action can come through many diverse forms. Its initial genesis can be born of intuition, research, personal failure, observance, skepticism, a desire for knowledge, an acknowledgement of insufficient reasoning, personal revelation, and so on and so forth. The origin is far less important than the undertaking. From what I've described above as the mundane status quo lives of most of us, your mindful and evidential manifestations of imbalance become too exhaustive and explicit for you to remain in a place of ignorance and inaction. And thus, you set out on your pilgrimage. Now, I want to stop here. I've given much thought to this, and I want to give some examples, or at least one example, as to what I'm talking about as the hero's journey. And I will do so with my own personal experience. This is my experience interacting with what we may consider, although I use may heavily here, the most educated classes within Calgary itself. These are individuals within inferior agencies that hold positions of presumed power and leadership. Specifically, I'm talking about artistic NGOs, non-governmental organizations that litter our entire city with ostentation, redundant managerial positions, diversity, equity, and inclusion ideologies and dogmas. Now, these institutions, whether you believe it or not, ensure the failure of what they otherwise are promoting and are promising as growth. They, whether inadvertently or not, choke an artistic class and civic art scene from acquiring what is our natural right to possess. And what I mean is things like necessary funding and the resources that we should be able to gain without laborious, time-consuming, and demoralizing petitions to bureaucracies. These are the same individuals and institutions that we assume covet our best interests, and erroneously we believe that they are so overwhelmingly intelligent as to possess answers that we, the peasants, could never have formulated for ourselves. Well, not only is this a false assumption, it has no biological or psychological basis at all. In terms of natural right, I will argue to the contrary of this assumption with a socio-political justification and a reasoning from experience that I believe I've had enough of to take up the case. Although representation of the people has a finite benefit, the demos, or the people themselves, know far better their needs than could ever be determined by title or technocracy. Let me begin with an interesting quote from Thomas Paine in his book entitled, nonetheless, Common Sense, published in 1776. For all men being originally equals, no one by birth, mere fortune, or privilege could have a right to set up his own family in perpetual presence to all others forever, and although himself may deserve some degree of honors by his contemporaries, his descendants may be far too unworthy to inherit them. One of the strongest natural proofs of the folly of hereditary right in kings is that nature disproves it. It otherwise would not so frequently turn it into ridicule by giving mankind an ass for a lion. Now, the individuals Thomas Paine was speaking of, in more current terms, are individuals like Bill Gates, the Waltons family, Donald Trump, Justin Trudeau, Klaus Schwab, George Bush Sr. and Jr., Jeff Bezos, the Rockefeller family, Warren Buffett, and the list could go on, but not to infinity. And the reasons I mention these names are, number one, they're familiar, and two, they do represent the more concentrated forms of power and privilege that are known to exist today. It is from what I have established in Proof of Verity and Villain that I'll continue. In an interview I did last year with David K. Johnson, professor of philosophy at King's College, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and the author of Audible's The Big Questions of Philosophy, he admitted both on the podcast itself and in his book that the U.S. has eclipsed into an oligarchy. Now, for those who may be wondering, an oligarchy is a system of government in which power is concentrated in the hands of a small, wealthy, elite group of individuals, families, and or corporations. And when I'm speaking about this philosopher, I'm not talking about some ultra-mega extremist here. Much to the contrary, he is probably the most liberally minded individual I've ever met. For him to astutely acknowledge the truth of a matter, given a potential leak in his otherwise bleeding heart, and I say that in all jest, Dave, but it should remain nothing for us to come to the same conclusion. I say all of this to establish a further premise. It is undeniable that an oligarchy can and does benefit greatly from a PMC, professional managerial class. As I have previously stated, this kind of representation materializes in the forms of the Musicians Union, CADA, Calgary Arts Development Association, NMC, National Music Center, Rise Up Initiative, many festival organizations, and these organizations are the structured forms of capital interests which are inarguably unaligned with the artistic class. Their allegiance is only to stakeholders, shareholders, venture and seed capitalists, etc. And I do not come by this understanding through speculation. Rather, it is through my experience with these individuals, conversations with them, and my interactions from my own experiences that I have gathered this information. Now, as this is being disseminated to a wider public, specific names and organizations are omitted here. I do not tell this story for the sake of your sympathy or empathy. Whatever it was I necessarily dealt with is all but satisfied. I have taken care of it in my mind to the greatest degree I can and my heart. I harbor not for a moment any grudge or any ill will toward the individuals that I'm speaking of. To be honest, this was one of the most salient, teachable moments I think I've ever had. I've learned something from this forthcoming story, and that is far more valuable to me than hatred or retribution. Furthermore, even in the face of such indignity, I can honestly say that I choose to love and have compassion for all of these individuals. Further to this, I do not tell this story to you, the people, for the sake of rumor or just idle talk. This type of behavior, to me, is, in some respect, why our current reality is plagued with antipathy and detestation of one another. I tell you this because these institutions elicit elements of hubris, privilege, inefficiency, redundancy, ignorance, objectification, devaluation, and when confronted, they can easily drop the airs of a polite society only to uncover the decay that is underneath. Additionally, and most importantly, I reveal this to you because, again, I think the people are more efficient and have more benevolent and understandable and applicable ways of solving problems that could ever be brought about by a corrupted bureaucracy. And I mean that. You, the people. So with all these things in mind, I'll begin. I had set up a roundtable discussion with two art agencies located here in Calgary. One agency, after having stalled and evaded my petition for nearly 2 years, finally decided that they would set up a date. Now, although this was inconvenient, the fact that I had to shuffle other dates with the other guests to accommodate this agency, and only a few days before the actual filming was to commence, this unnamed agency unceremoniously withdrew their participation. Not only was that a slight insult to me, especially after 2 years, and anything that one may resemble as proper business acumen, whether acknowledged by the public or of any concern to the institution themselves, it is a disgrace to a public that demands their attention. So I was left with the decision to do the episode or not, and I realized that although this was highly inconsiderate, it does not constitute defeat for me, nor somehow should I feign submission to their ignorance. And so the date remained. Now, I should also mention that there was a representative from Basic Income Calgary who presented himself the consummate gentleman, and he not only accepted the invitation, but he arrived early in a cordial manner, really nice older guy. So after this gentleman stepped into the studio, a representative from the third art-related organization arrived, and I noticed that they were a little uneasy. So I complimented them on their form of dress, and then I just ushered them to the studio. I introduced the two of them, and after a few pleasantries, I began to explain the absence of this former. Upon explaining this other art organization representative basically told me that I had misrepresented myself, that there were supposed to be stakeholders and shareholders, and I guess they were under the illusion that there were going to be a lot of people in the studio. Now, that's completely incorrect. And number two, I would never use the terminology stakeholder or shareholder because I simply don't believe in its construction. So after explaining that, I moved on and breached the subject of the Mayor's Luncheon for the Arts. I may not have that completely correct, but it was basically an awards show, and I think it was held at night for the first time, whereas it used to be a luncheon held by the mayor. However, in speaking with a lot of musicians around town, a lot of artists around town, no one that I spoke with knew that there was anything going on, that there was anything like some kind of arts and mayoral extravaganza happening. As a matter of fact, even from this individual's own agency, there were people that didn't know that this was happening. So when I asked them why there was not that much knowledge, or it had not been disseminated to the wider artistic public in Calgary, they asked me if I lived under a rock. Now, I kind of took this as kind of an ignorant and certainly an unbecoming question from someone that should be representing sincerity. But as I reflected on the rock statement, I could only think that if the rock this representative was speaking of meant Calgary, then perhaps I and many others in this city do live in what otherwise could be considered the dark. But I brushed it off, and I did ask them again why the greater part of Calgary was neither represented in this initiative or even had a clue as to its existence. At this point, they asked me what group of people I was referring to. Now, I didn't understand what the word group meant, and I was a little confused as to that terminology. And so I asked them, I said, well, what group are you talking about? And they said, oh no, you're not going to get off the hook that easy. And I said, well, I don't feel like I'm on a hook. I just don't know what you're talking about. And maybe you could explain what you mean by group. And they said, well, the indigenous were there. There were other people, represented certain sexual proclivities. And so what group are you talking about? And then it dawned on me, and I understood what they were asking me. And I kind of laughed and said, I'm not talking about a group, except to say the human species. Everyone, every artist, Homo sapiens, the entirety, at least of Calgary. Now, as far as my recollection goes, this mayor's lunch has never been billed as the mayor's lunch for minorities. It is a celebration, as far as I'm aware of, that has a history within Calgary and has never had any other ideology attached to it than the celebration of an entire artistic class. When I explained to them that I was talking about all people, I don't think that they could get this all-encompassing idea around their head. It was too much for them to contemplate. And they also disclosed at that moment a desire to work with other agencies that were harboring and employing this DEI ideology and dogma. So, not wanting to pursue that query anymore and seeing that they were a little uncomfortable, I basically just showed each participant to their seat. Now, if you recall, there also was an older gentleman here, and although he was a little stoic and remained a little perplexed at his observation of what was happening within this conversation, and frankly, I was feeling a little perplexed myself, he politely sat down. It was at this point that the arts representative aggressively shot out, "No, I'm leaving." Now, the older guy and I shot around to see this individual in some emotional distress. And so I immediately said to them, I said, "Well, of course, you don't have to stay if you don't want to. That's fine." There was obviously tension in the room, but I still felt at liberty to ask why they felt they had to leave. And at this, they said, "I don't need to tell you anything." And I responded again, "Of course, you don't have to tell me a goddamn thing at all. You don't have to say anything to me if you don't want to. That's fine." And then the individual said, "I don't answer to you." And it was at that point that I took a little offense, and I did say, I said, you're wholly incorrect with that statement. Not only do you answer to me, but you answer to every single artist within this city. And don't get that one wrong. To maybe justify what they were saying, they said, "You don't understand. I have stakeholders and shareholders that I need to remain accountable to. I just can't keep saying anything I want." And it was at this point that I said to them, I think you've just spoken the quiet part out loud. Because the stakeholder and the shareholder are necessarily even above the corporate interest itself. And this in no way ever could help the artist wanting or trying to make a living for themselves. Now, of course, this was most unappreciated by them. And although there's, a few minor details that don't need to be addressed here, there is one more petition that I gave them that I wanted them to address. And this was in the form of a thought experiment. I began explaining the nature of the exercise, and I asked them to please, before they left, just contemplate this. And I began. I said, suppose for the sake of argument, there's a guy sitting at home that is completely distraught over his inability to create nor make a living with his art. He is literally at the end of his rope. His rent is late, his girlfriend has just abandoned him, he lacks any food or any money to solve any one of his situations. No one to care for him, nowhere to turn. All is dark, hopeless, and the macabre thought of him ending it all floods into his consciousness. So, he grabs a chair, he grabs a rope, and with tears streaming down his already soaked face, he climbs up. Now, at this point, I reiterated that this is still only a thought experiment, not meant to be taken literally, but I continued. There is a computer turned on in the corner of his room. Somehow, our episode is playing in the background. Through the pain and turmoil that he is experiencing, his ear catches something that snaps him into a moment of clarity. With the little attention he possesses, he hears you speak of something wonderful, a sign of hope, a new civic initiative, something, anything. It is now that his psychosis abates just enough to consider that for him, perhaps not all is lost. He takes the rope from around his neck, he steps off the chair, and thankfully, he lives to fight another day. Now, I said, although this is a mere thought experiment, and not that anybody watches this show anyway, I hope they do, and thank you for watching. Would it not be something for you to even contemplate that you did something beneficial for the life of another person? And I wasn't trying to gaslight them or anything like that. I wanted to just propose this as a thought experiment. But instead of saying anything toward the offering that I had just given them, they screamed that I wouldn't let them go. You won't let me go, I have to go. And I realized at that moment that they were actually presumably suffering a psychotic break. And I didn't want that in the studio. I didn't want that for them, and I didn't want it for me. And having given someone something to think about that heavy, and all they can continue to think about is their own self-interest, I knew there was nothing left. And so I said, I think you should go, because I think you need to. And I led them out of the studio, and although they were shaking and once again, not psychotically well, they left. I went downstairs embarrassed, and I think I was feeling a little bit, I don't know, trepidatious and a little emotional myself. I apologized to the older gentleman, and he said, look, man, he said, I don't know what that was all about. And personally, you didn't say anything offensive. You were petitioning them from your heart. He stayed, and we did the episode. I haven't released the episode yet. It's still in the can, if you will, and I may release it. And this was one of my experiences, of which I've had several. But I'm not here to gossip. The reason that I'm telling you this is because you are not in any way in the hands of superiors. This individual gets a lot of government money, and they would be assumed as responsible and emotionally together, and this was just not the experience. And these are the purse strings that they hold over an entire artistic population. I don't think this is correct. And I obviously, you people have not heard this story, but we deserve better than this, I think. And not in any way am I putting down the individual, but I think we need people in governance that can do the best for the people themselves, not for stakeholders, which already have a plethora of money and will never run out and will never suffer a day financially. Stakeholders, venture seed capitalists, all of these things. We're better than this. And we're better than that construct. Again, I think the people themselves, if we could get our head around it, and I can't convince you of it, we are the ones that could ultimately solve the problem, get the answer, and be able to be far more self-sustained than we are right now. And that is our right. That is a natural right of existence of each and every one of us. I speak of myself, but I also speak on your behalf, because it's as true for you as it is for me. I cannot bring this point home hard enough, and I can't convince you of the truth. But this is what the hero's journey is all about. It is only by this individual undertaking that you will be convinced of both your worth and your ultimate authority. And with anything that I say in any further episodes, this truth of your authority is the greatest part of the indelible change that I've proposed. It is for this reason that I go through the hero's journey with you all. Now, I know that sounds maybe romantic or whatever, And you don't have to put a name to it. But what it is self-discovery, realizing how amazingly great you are, and that above any politician or above any bureaucrat, you actually have the power granted to you by nature itself. Whether you utilize it or not is your choice, or your belief to understand that this is true. And it is true. So I want to leave this episode here. It is for the love of each individual, even for the bureaucrat and the politician, that I say this. I will say one more thing about the understanding of politics. We have shed the fallacy of our original construction in the form of monarchy and things like this, but there are aspects of what we think and how we think that have parasitically clung to the nation, and I think things that we need to reckon with. And simply, this is the fact that by nature itself, you are entitled to live well and to not have aggressive power or power over you that would unnaturally take away those rights. For some reason, we believe that because someone is good at one thing and maybe that has more respect than another, that they actually know politics or they know how to govern. And that is simply another fallacy. Doctors are not assumed moral for what they do any more than a drummer is for his particular skill. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say that skill is unnecessary for governance. Its only application would be to serve for the buffoonery of politicians. Politics is nothing more than a performance art, and that should be established. Government is antithetical to the theater of politics and only stands to serve the natural rights of all people. So in stating this, it is my truest desire to somehow empower and encourage anyone listening to this. In my experience, the ones that we deem as the most intelligent are simply not. And it's not that they're less intelligent than us, but we are on equal footing. Absolutely. So I thank you for joining in today. I will be touching upon the next two aspects in the hero's journey next week. And I hope this sits with you a little bit. And maybe it even makes you uncomfortable, or it makes you realize, yeah, Jesus Christ, I mean, The Matrix was just a movie, but there are elements, man, that, look the same without the computer simulation. So thank you. I appreciate you tuning in. Again, like, subscribe, share, all this good stuff. And I'll see you in a week. Thank you.